Good morning, good day, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our show. Today we're going to take a deep dive into a topic that's fascinated, frightened, and fueled debates for centuries. This is the concept of the Garden of Eden, and we're going to talk about how ancient myths, right up to modern interpretations, have played a pivotal role in the narrative about the Garden from Eden. So our discussion will take a look at a lot of different concepts, from the battle between good and evil, humanity, the human condition. So grab a snack, get yourself comfortable and buckle up, because it's going to be a very interesting ride. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to our show. It's a pleasure to have you guys here for what's going to prove to be a very interesting conversation.
Can't wait.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Right. So let me just start with a couple of, let me just introduce you guys. So first of all, down below, we have Dr. Joshua Bowen. He's an accomplished Assyriologist with a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Bowen has dedicated his career to studying ancient languages and cultures, particularly those of the Sumerians and Akkadians. His extensive research provides a very deep understanding of the historical and cultural contexts within which these cultures play off. Dr. Bowen is also the author of several influential books, amongst them The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. His work challenges traditional interpretations and sheds light on often misunderstood aspects of ancient texts. And to my other, I always get confused around. And joining us is Tristan Kapp, he's a PhD candidate, widely known as the Friendly Satanist online. Tristan is a modern Satanist dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing Satanism. He offers rational and ethical perspectives, emphasizing critical thinking, individualism, and secular humanism. Tristan's approach is very approachable. His style has made him a very prominent figure in the community, and his insights will help us to understand how ancient concepts of Satan have also been intertwined in all these contemporary contexts. So tonight we are going to explore a couple of different questions. How did the figure of Satan evolved in all these mythological narratives, and how what I'm always fascinated by, and I think we can start with this, is this historical context of the biblical narrative, because correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not unique to one specific religion. It's a theme that repeats itself throughout different cultures. If you can maybe start us off on that, Dr. Josh.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking about, the Genesis 1 and 2, 3, these creation stories that we see in the Hebrew Bible. Again, I think as we've all encountered, so many Christian apologists or people sort of on that side would like this to be sort of a genre that has been handed down from on high, right? And something that sort of is novel, is unique. And the reality is that even if you held to the incredibly conservative and I would say impossible position of like a Mosaic authorship in the 15th or 13th centuries, whatever, even then, these would not be novel, even in that time. And so we have Sumerian texts, we have Akkadian texts that, of course, present creation of humanity, creation of deities, creation of the world, cosmogonies, topogonies. Like, we have all of these mythological texts that go back into like the third millennium. They sort of explode, at least in Mesopotamia, early in the second millennium. But I mean, obviously, long before anything that was seen but before Israel is even a nation. So, yeah, and sort of the themes that we see are are pretty common, right? Humanity created by the gods to serve a purpose, right? And of course, in the biblical text, these are things that I think sometimes get missed, sometimes get glossed over. Which of course is, I think as Tristan well knows, like, these are theological concepts that sort of people kind of pile on top of the text as these lenses that they read the text through, particularly thinking about the figure of Satan, right? Like, the serpent in creation contexts, or in early contexts that the Genesis 2, the Eden narrative sort of function in, are, again, not novel. You have serpents in a variety of these types of texts, but yet, what, and I'll land here, sorry guys, but like, what people that have theological commitments do, intentionally or unintentionally, is they read later theological interpretations of earlier passages back onto that, figure that's in the gardens. Oh, that's Satan, right? That's Satan back there. And is it though?
Exactly.
So yeah,
that's very, very creative retrofitting. That's very interesting. And the thing is that there's a lot of cultural influences as well, and maybe Tristan, you can weigh in on this. How do these ancient Near Eastern cultures and influences reflect in our modern interpretations of theology, religion, etc.?
So, I mean, to start off with, I could listen to Dr. Josh speak all day, because it's so refreshing to hear someone with such absolutely well-grounded academic rhetoric. It's music to my ears.
You guys are incredibly kind and generous. Thank you.
No, it's absolutely wonderful. It's not something we often get into contact with. But to answer your question, Dean, it's actually very fascinating. As Dr. Josh quite prominently referred, is the anachronistic interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, and the fact that a lot of people affirm very I'd say perennialist and minimalist sort of interpretations. Oh no, it's a Mosaic authorship, therefore, it was written by Moses, and it continues this golden thread of messianic prophecy, and ends with the malevolent evil that was responsible for all of humanity's sin and everything. And it's interesting. I read the other day an article about the esoteric interpretations, or if you want to use esotericism as a sort of a hermeneutical lens for the Genesis narrative and the fall of humankind and this quasi-Satan per se. I think Dr. Josh can add me here and can aid me here in the fact that, as he quite remarkably mentioned, the word Satan does not appear in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew word Satan is quite different from the word that is used in Genesis. The word for serpent in Genesis is Nagash, or Nagash, if I'm not mistaken. And invariably, if you compare it from a narratological point of view, you'll find that this entire narrative actually was a mythological archetype for representing or carrying a sort of social commentary against ancient snake worship in the ancient Near East. Am I right in saying that, Dr. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably got layers of polemicizing going on in the text, but yeah.
No. But you see a quite common thread in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, especially about the snake taking a prominent role in referencing wisdom or healing or chaos. You've got the snake Apophis in the Egyptian mythology, who is said to consume the sun every evening when the sun travels to the underworld. You've got the Leviathan, which I think also derives from an earlier Akkadian or Sumerian myth, that refers to the monster of the sea that Baal fights in the Old Testament as a sort of primordial enemy. And so this kind, and you also get the snake in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which eats the what do you call it, the seaweed for eternal life of Utnapishtim. In the end, and basically causes Gilgamesh to have a complete existential Nietzschean crisis on the beach there. So there's absolutely layers and layers of what we can comparatively understand from various Akkadian Sumerian religions that basically just arrive and revolve around certain even Gnostic interpretations of wisdom and knowledge and good and evil and all of these constructs. It's such a wealth of ancient oral tradition. I think it would take an entire thesis even to deconstruct that entire narrative in and of itself.
But yet it's it's such a I'm listening. I just want to say for the record here, like sitting here listening to you guys, I'm sitting here fascinated, and I'm going like, why the fuck did I never learn about this shit? This is fascinating stuff, very interesting. So let's move it along a little bit, and let's talk about this comparative mythology that we find between different areas. I think we can start with you, Dr. Josh, and then if you can weigh in afterwards, Tristan. Just let's have a look at some of the similarities and differences between these figures in the mythologies, some of the Mesopotamian gods, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're talking about the Eden narrative in particular, it is interesting from a comparative sense, because there are certain texts in the Hebrew Bible, even in the primeval history in Genesis 1 through 11, that are like very clearly sort of whole cloth pulled from earlier Akkadian and Sumerian mythological texts. So, for example, Genesis 6 through 9 with the flood story, like this is Atrahasis, right? This is Gilgamesh Tablet 11, right? Now that doesn't mean that it's just cut and paste and they're saying all the same things. Like that's not what's going on. Very clearly, that's not what's going on. But it's very evident that story about flood, right? And so in the same way that Eminem is clearly pulling from Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll in his song, like there is no mistake. It's not like there was this tradition about rock and roll and this same, set of, riffs or whatever that both of them independently came up with by chance. No, like he's clearly pulling from that. We don't necessarily have a single myth from which the Garden of Eden story is coming, right? And Bruce Wells has a monograph. I talked to him a couple of months ago. He's down at University of Texas Austin. He's a great guy. He's writing about this Garden of Eden narrative and sort of its precursors. But like there isn't this, like you can't flip open, Ben Foster's Before the Muses and find, the early Garden of Eden story. We don't. There's not that. But that doesn't mean that the themes, the types, the things, that the main structures that you see in there do not predate and form the building blocks for what we see in the Eden narrative. So just a couple of those, and then Tristan, you take it away. A couple of things that we see as actually Tristan pointed out, like the serpent sort of motif there. We see this in connection with this loss of the chance at eternal life or immortality. And you see this in a couple of really prominent Akkadian texts. The first one, as Tristan talked about, was the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And so in Tablet 11, he's Enkidu has died. He's gone on the hunt, as it were, to try to find immortality, and he finds himself ultimately with the flood survivor, and the flood survivor says, like, who's going to convene the gods for you, right? Like, are they going to send another worldwide flood like they did for me? And no, you're not going to get that. So, but sort of as a, a parting gift, right? His wife says, come on, tell him about the plant. So there's this plant that's down in the water. And so he goes down and he gets it. And again, it's this so close yet so far away, right? Theme. And so he instead of eating the plant, he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take it back to Uruk, the city that he's the king of. And I'm going to give it to an old man, a part of it, and see if it works, right? So on his way back, he stops to take a bath and a snake comes up and eats it, right? And the snake sheds its skin. And of course, that's an etiological, myth there for why snakes shed their skin. But it's so close. And the snake is the one that is responsible for sort of, robbing him of it. We see something similar, but less pronounced in Adapa and the South Wind, which, Adapa is Ea, Enki's sort of right-hand man as far as, a worshiper. And he has been imparted with all the secret knowledge of the gods. And through circumstances, he finds himself going up to stand before Anu, one of the big three chief deities. And Ea says to him, hey, when you get up there, be aware, they're going to offer you food and drink. Don't partake of them, because the food and the drink are the food and drink of death. Well, they weren't, right? And Ea knew that. They were the food and drink of immortality, right? Or of eternal life.
Sounds like an apple.
Right. And what's interesting about this, and this sort of the subtle nuance, is that one of the two doorkeepers, to the entrance there, is Nagishida, which is, one of the sort of serpent characters, right? So again, subtle, but they're playing in. But that the interesting, and then Tristan, you take it. One of the interesting things about the Eden narrative in this respect, and that I think gets missed, is that I'm pretty much convinced that Yahweh intentionally lies. So if you look at Genesis 2:17, the text is very clear. The Hebrew is very clear, right? On the day that you eat of this thing, you will surely die. And of course, apologists want that to mean like a day is 1,000 years to the Lord. And so it could be like, whatever. And of course, what they have to struggle with is what happens in Genesis 3 in the beginning, like at end of verse 5, where it says, in the day that you eat of the fruit, your eyes will be open. And what happens? They eat it and their eyes open immediately. It's the same phrase, right? Same construction. But at any rate, this is what we see in Adapa and the South Wind, right? Ea, I think most Assyriologists would argue at this point, knowingly lies to Adapa and says, you're going to die if you eat this stuff. And there's a reason behind it. And Ea is, and this is the key, Ea is not seen as immoral for having lied to Adapa. And so this is one of the things, and I swear, Tristan, I'm shutting up after this. This is one of the things that I think is, apologists really should take a step back here and think about this, because they have this idea that if Yahweh lies, then the whole thing falls apart, right? Because you can't have Yahweh lying. And then so they make all kinds of excuses for, like, the story in 2 Kings 20 or 1 Kings 20, I mix them up, but with Micaiah ben Imlah, right? Where Yahweh sends the lying spirit, right? Well, he's not technically lying, right? He's like having somebody else lie, like, mismute that shit. Because he's not the bad guy for doing it. Yahweh's not the bad guy in the narrative. That's the whole point. It's part of this. It's part of how these cosmogonies and anthropogonies are structured. And you have these things that clearly the reader is supposed to make these connections back to these earlier texts and pull information from that. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think, Dr. Josh, you don't need to apologize at all. I think it's important it's important for the audience to have as much information about this as possible. And I think you're providing an absolutely fascinating and very unique perspective to this entire debacle because of the fact that you're, explaining the multifacetedness of this narrative and from an ancient world, and especially in comparing it to some other ancient cultural narratives that I think is absolutely incremental. Because of the fact that if you want to understand the Garden of Eden narrative, you have to obviously understand it from its cultural milieu. It's the fact you have to understand it from the lens of its contemporaries. And I think another interesting point to make is we should also take into consideration that a lot of the imagery from the divinities in the book of Genesis, especially, not just the snake, but it takes a very anthropomorphic stance. And the fact that you mentioned that Yahweh lies, that's a very anthropomorphic characteristic. And that was something that was very characteristic of ancient religion and ancient gods. And the fact that these gods and these deities ineffably represent the desires and the characteristics of humans themselves. And I think that this idea of wisdom and you can even ascribe to a certain degree, and please tell me if I'm being anachronistic, Dr. Joss, but I'd say you can even classify the Genesis narrative, that specific Garden of Eden motif, as a sort of early propaganda to, for example, coerce ancient society because if you understand it from a socio-historical lens, in trying to understand and criticize the text to what did it mean to its original audience, you can argue that in essence the snake was represented as this evil, or rather deceptive character, in order to encourage individuals to worship Yahweh, similar to what the Roman Empire did to the pagans in misrepresenting the pagan deities in order to promote this Eurocentric concept of Jesus Christ as the state religion of Rome. And this characterization, I mean, there's a lot of colonialization and a lot of imperialization that we can see, and I'd even argue fascism in the Old Testament from the Israelites in telling, in classifying themselves as a separate nation, apart from the rest, and chosen by God or by Yahweh in essence to represent, and basically just going to certain lands such as Canaan and saying, like, listen, Yahweh told us we can take this land now and you have no say in this. It sounds like Trevor Noah making jokes about, we are the British Empire, and taking the flag and just jamming it into the ground and annexing that land like it's theirs to begin with. So there's this kind of, what we can argue from a narrative sense, a sort of propaganda portrayed from also this also taboo knowledge. The idea of thinking critically is taboo, hence staying away from the tree of good and evil, and the tree of knowledge is detestable. It's similar to what all cults argue, especially the apologists that Dr. Josh spoke of now recently, is the fact that they completely dissuade you from thinking critically. They completely dissuade you from thinking about the idea of criticizing the authorities. And I think this was one of the most powerful methods of conveying such a message. And of course, trying to play one thing off to another is essentially a very powerful way of doing it. It's a powerful social psychological phenomenon, which is frequently used in all political and literature schemes. You can even see that in the promotion of the Davidian monarchy and the genealogies in the Old Testament, and the way it's promoted to promote a sort of genealogy in order to assert a divine kingship of some sort, because of the fact that authority in the ancient Near East was very much associated with divinity. And so I think this entire construct of the Garden of Eden, in essence, is similar to not just propaganda, but also the idea of a narrative being used to convey a message to an illiterate audience that had no form of writing or literacy back whenever it was written, in order to get them to do a certain thing and to live a sort of lifestyle, because that was the way that the authorities or individuals in power could influence their followers to a certain degree. So yeah, as I think Dr. Josh also poignantly mentioned, there's no single tradition you can identify with this Genesis narrative. In fact, it's a syncretism of a multiplicity of traditions that is found throughout the ancient Near East. purely by emphasis on the idea of the snake and the themes and the motifs in the text in and of itself.
Right. So, we're more or less at the halfway mark. So I just want to take a minute we've got some comments and interesting questions from our audience as well. If you don't mind highlighting them for us, Wes, I believe, is in the background. So first of all, Jesus Tale says Euphrates join at Babylon. However, they also both begin on different sides of the Ararat region. Any chance Eden was supposed to be in Ararat as well?
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm also going to say, like,
yeah, I mean, I think that it's not really something that I've looked. Of course, early on, the word Eden, was theorized to come from Sumerian Eden, which means like the steppe, like the plains. It's like a fruitful area out away from the city. I don't think that's really widely held anymore. Of course, in Genesis 2, you sort of have this, the 4 rivers that are going out, and so like people have tried to make connections there. That's something that I haven't really spent much of any time on, trying to like pinpoint where they would have thought. Certainly, in the whole of the primeval history, and we can talk about this if you guys would like, but like there is clear focus on Babylon, the city, right? And the movement that you see, the narrative arc that you see, particularly starting in Genesis 2, but culminating in Genesis 11 with the city and Tower of Babel story, that is definitely movement away from innocence toward the city. And so, but it focuses on Babylon. So yeah, I mean, but as far as, where they would have conceived of Eden, I don't know, the people that have written on that. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to go look. It's a good question.
Yeah.
May I add to that, Dean?
Yes, of course. Go for it.
Yeah, no, I just want to add, and I think that Eden is, and I'm going to keep it brief. I think that Eden should be understood as a literary device. It wasn't necessarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Josh, but I don't think that it's necessarily referential to a physical place. It was a literary device, and I connected to my earlier sentiment that the concept or the construct of Eden was a sort of a utopic paradise per se, in order to convey a certain message. So the focus was not Eden. The focus was the fact that Eden was this, for example, Atlantis per se, this esoteric place of where wisdom thrived and everything was perfect. And so humanity, through its own perceived selfishness, in order to disagree with the divine hierophant and demiurge, inevitably ruined it. And so humanity is then the most evil creature possible. And so that literary device then uses it to keep humans from, stepping out of line.
But guys, come on, Ron Wyatt has found a bag of fertilizer in the desert. That's
time
where
to retire. Time to hang it up.
Here's another one. Corporal and Moore wrote a Ugaritic text. I don't know, fucking idea what that even is. A snake charm where Adamu fights off the snake who poisoned the tree of life. I never hear Corporal and Moore's work mentioned on these shows. Is it?
Yeah. So, I mean, Tristan, I don't know if you want to.
No. I have no knowledge about that. So go for it, Dr. Josh.
So everybody understands what so Ugarit, it comes from. There was a city on the Mediterranean coast, north of what we would consider like Israel proper, called the city of Ugarit, and they really, so it's part of like that late Amarna period. This is the late Bronze Age, and the city was very wealthy. And one of the things that we found, I want to say back in the, I don't remember when they were found. I don't want to even guess. I thought that was 20s somewhere, but Ras Shamra is what the site is called. But a bunch of tablets were found there. And the language of these tablets were primarily written as the language of the city of Ugarit, so they called it Ugaritic. And Ugaritic is it's a cuneiform script, but it's alphabetic, which is novel. And the reason that the texts are so important is it's a Semitic language, Canaanite, right? Like that from that region. And it's like where the Baal myths find their home, right? So you have like the Baal cycle, you have Moth, you have Yam, like death, the sea, you have Anat, Asherah, like you have all of these figures, these divine figures, that all these mythologies are present there in the Ugaritic text. And so there's a lot of information that scholars have. And a very clear example of this, Isaiah 27:1, where it talks about like the twisting serpent and the fleeing serpent. This is like a slightly loose paraphrase of a section of the Baal cycle, but it uses the same Semitic words there that are found in Ugaritic text. So to bring that back to the question, there are people in the study of the Hebrew Bible that sort of specialize additionally in Ugaritic texts, right? I took Ugaritic when I was doing my PhD.
Enough, you know.
Well, I mean, like, so I know Ugaritic to a certain extent, right? But like people like Ted Lewis, who was my professor that taught me Ugaritic at Hopkins, like he's like a specialist in it. And so I don't know all the secondary literature from Ugaritic. Dennis Pardee is another phenomenal scholar that works in the Ugaritic texts. Mark Smith also. But anyway, if people are interested in resources about that, please shoot me an email at digitalhammurabi@gmail.com, and I'll pull some stuff together. But I don't know of this particular text that's being referred to, but that doesn't mean anything. Very well could be there, and that could be what it's about. So.
Right, and then we also have, do you know of Lilith and Adam stories, and any comments about how it works or doesn't work with the narrative that we know from our Genesis accounts? Now, correct me if I'm wrong before you guys answer. Isn't Lilith was supposed to be Adam's wife? But
according to normative tradition, yes. But so, as Dr. Josh will also agree with me, there are two different creation narratives in the Genesis Old Testament. The Kabbalah, essentially tradition, was a Jewish mystical tradition that developed later on in the whole monotheistic Yahwism. And so this entire Kabbalistic myth essentially, and Dr. Josh also mentioned Isaiah earlier. And so there's a specific Isaiah text. I can't remember which Isaiah text it is, but this Isaiah text speaks of Adam's first wife, or the first woman that was created, essentially. I don't remember the exact Hebrew. Old Testament scholarship is not my field of expertise, but I believe Josh can fill in the gaps for me later. But the simple story about it is purely that Lilith is also someone that derives from also an old Akkadian and Sumerian, if I'm not mistaken, ancient Near Eastern religion. Lili too, if I'm not mistaken, is the common reference. I don't know how correct that is. I digress. The concept of Lilith, in essence, and the idea of that she was the first wife of Adam, just derives from a Kabbalistic myth that essentially tries to marry the two creation narratives with one another. And so the Kabbalah essentially refers to Lilith as a sort of woman that rebelled against Yahweh, or that did not submit to Adam's authority, in the sense of that in the ancient Near East, sexuality was a very frequent theme in terms of describing authority, in terms of penetration and the fact of who was on top and who was at the bottom. So it's not something that is prominent in the LGBTQ community per se. the entire idea of a top and a bottom. It was also something that was interesting in the ancient Near East, in where authority was described. So if the woman essentially, this was one of the criticisms that was lodged against Lilith, is the fact that she was the one that wanted to be on top, and therefore putting Adam in a sort of submissive position. And so that was also that. And the fact that she did not obey Adam's orders, in the fact that she did not submit to him or listen to him, as was common, in the sense of that's where also the Genesis narrative, in terms of the woman being made of the man's rib, essentially comes as a sort of, authority motif. That's why she wasn't made from his clavicle or his shoulder bone, but from his rib, to essentially represent a sort of inferiority. And I believe the entire motif and idea of Lilith, essentially, and connecting it to mythology even, in later also you see esoteric traditions, in terms of Western esotericism, you'll see Lilith taking a sort of a more goddess-like role. But that's completely unrelated to the historical and social context of the Old Testament, in terms of Lilith essentially just representing history's first feminist, per se, in the fact of throwing the big old middle finger to Yahweh, in saying that, listen, I am not going to submit to male authority, because rightfully so, I am a woman and I dare not submit myself to unjustified male ideological hegemony. But yeah, Dr. Josh, if you have anything to add to that, please do.
Oh no.
But where's the origin of this figure of Lilith? Is it biblical, or is it purely Kabbalistic?
Definitely Kabbalistic. The word Lilith exists nowhere in the Old Testament, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely a later development.
Yeah. Oh. Absolutely.
Interesting.
I think, Tristan, I think it'd be worth saying to everybody, and I know this is a little more broad and methodological, and we don't have to spend much time here. I don't think either Tristan and I would say that like interpretive models that are not historical critical are bad, right? That's not what we're saying at all. In fact, I think they're very, very important. And the example that I tend to try to use would be like if we were standing and looking at a painting, the main question on my mind, and I doubt on many people's minds, would be like, I wonder what the author meant by this. That's not generally what people think when they look at a painting, right? That they're focused on how it makes them feel, right? And what it says, how it speaks to them, what it says to them. And I think a great example of this actually is if people are Seinfeld fans, there's this portrait of Kramer that gets painted, and Kramer's standing there, and the husband and wife who ultimately buy the piece, his struggle is man's struggle, and the husband says, I loathe him, and yet they both love the painting, right? They come away with completely different interpretations of it, but that has nothing to do with what the woman was thinking or doing when she painted, Kramer, right? Those are very distinct things, and there's nothing wrong with interpretive models. They're essential. It's how we function, right? What we have to do, though, is ensure, to keep the analogy going, that I don't go stand looking at a painting and say to the person standing next to me, your interpretation is wrong, and you have to abide by my interpretation and what it says to me. That's the critical part. For someone to be able to say, what, when I read through Genesis 1, what I think is, that God really loves me, right? And he's very powerful, and he's going to take care of me no matter what happens. Hey, you know what? Live your best life. I'm all about it. But when you turn to me and say, now we're going to put those 10 commandments in your schools so your kids can memorize them. Like, whoa, hold up, like, you know, these are not the same. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think you made a very, very valid point. However, I would also add, and it's sort of perhaps one would argue a contrarian point of view, in the sense of that it could also be dangerous to allow people to make such interpretations. I remember a brilliant professor I had class with, Professor Daniel Peter Veldsman, who gave me what was it, the philosophy of theology back during my masters. He basically had this brilliant argument in displaying that the Bible lays defenseless in the hands of laymen. And that's not to say that people are stupid or people who interpret it are stupid. Merely that a lot of the times we see, and this is something that Dean can also attest to in South Africa especially, and I think that's also something that's quite prevalent in the US, now that I think of it, is the fact of how the Bible, especially in terms of the idea of Adam and Eve and the gender roles and sexuality and all of these, what Professor Richard Carney refers to in his book Anatheism as ontotheology, is the fact of how people have a very basic ontology, or rather approach or hermeneutic to the text, or interpretation of the text. And I think that the historical critical point of view is a start to rectify the framework, because if example in art as well, you know, you get the Renaissance art, and you've got obviously modern art, and you can't use the same lens to interpret Renaissance art with modern art. For example, you can't compare Van Gogh and Rembrandt. So I think that in essence, if someone takes the Mona Lisa, for example, it's a stupid example. What's a good example? The idea of that frequent painting when it comes to, I don't know who painted it, whether it was Rembrandt or some other Dutch painter, where this demon basically lies on top of the chest of this woman, basically using it as an analogy for the fact that, okay, demons exist when you experience sleep paralysis, for example. And I think that, for example, in political contexts, when referring to Genesis, especially in this context, and the idea of Adam and Eve and the serpent and stuff, and misattributing, for example, the snake as Satan, and the idea of the man and the woman as unequal, and using that as a reference point for fundamental theology as to why the woman is unequal, and Satan is to be blamed for humans' inequity, therefore not taking responsibility for any of your acts, can be a dangerous interpretation. And while I agree with you, the freedom, for example, that people may interpret the idea of, okay, God loves me and wants the best for me in terms of the Genesis narrative, that's a beautiful interpretation, and I think that's worth praising. But I also think that in general there are certain interpretations that have disastrous socio-political effects in modernity that can only be rectified via a historical critical lens per se, but as a starting point to guide a interpretation.
Yeah, and I just so you know, I agree completely with everything that you just said, and I think that a good example of something that I think what I would like to see people doing, and then we can go back to the narrative. Sorry, is what apologists do, most apologists anyway, or at least Christians, with slavery, right? Like when they read Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25, that most people, an uncomfortable amount do, but most people that are Christians don't go, well, hot damn, we should have slavery again, right? They don't do that, right? Or when they read through the conquest narratives, right? Or 1 Samuel 15, and they see all the genocide, they don't go, well, let me go get my gun, right? Thank whatever, right? That they don't do that. But the reason that they don't do that is because they have modern moral sensibilities that are informing their interpretation. And so that's their modern morality, their progressive morality, that slavery bad, thank God, slavery bad is, the text is filtering through that lens. The problem, as you're pointing out, is that some people don't have that when it comes to things like equality, right? Or things like gender roles, right? They have what the text is still greatly affecting their moral interpretation. So yes, I agree with you completely. So yes, very, very good caveat. Thank you.
Thanks for adding that.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about symbolism and imagery. Because there's a lot of imagery in the Near Eastern art and literature that compare to those that are found in the Eden story. And you guys touched on this a little bit earlier, but what can this comparison tell us about cultural exchanges, and were there even any cultural exchanges going on at the time?
I think this is perfect for Dr. Josh. Take it away.
Oh, I mean, I'll lead with one. So I think sort of the motif of the, I don't want to use the term, but like let's say the innocent human, right? The way that they would have thought about this, and I use this in its ancient Near Eastern context and its meaning, this idea of like the brute, right? The one that savage is the word that you see, but I don't like, obviously I don't like using that term, but it's combined with thinking of Enkidu. Let's just talk specifically about who we're talking about here. So Enkidu is the equal that is created to push back against Gilgamesh and the Gilgamesh epic. And the way that he's described, right, incredibly powerful but very animal-like, right? His primary characteristics are animalistic. So he runs with the herds, he drinks at the watering hole, like and when Shamhat, the prostitute, comes out, the way that she turns him into a human is she has sex with him for 6 days and 7 nights, or 7 days and 7 nights, depending on which version you read. And then once he like loses that main animal part, like he can't run as fast as he used to, his legs are weak, the animals don't want to be near him anymore. He's taken this massive step toward becoming human, away from the animals. Then he, eats bread, drinks beer, gets clothed, right? These things make him human. And then ultimately, like the pinnacle of him becoming a man is he's brought to the city. He's brought to Uruk. So and we talked about this just a little bit before, but if you think about the movement in the Epic of Gilgamesh in so many different places, it's toward the city. Everything is toward the city, toward civilization, because civilization in the Mesopotamian mindset is the pinnacle. Like it's what it means to be really human, right? It's to be in the city. It's urbanism. Well, and this is something that you see throughout Mesopotamian texts. So like there's a Sumerian story called the Marriage of Martu, and Martu means like Westerner, right? And it's like Westerner, bad, right? And when it describes this woman is thinking about marrying this god, this figure Martu, and her girlfriend is talking to her saying, "Why would you want to do that?" Or it's what half the story is about. And she says, "He eats raw meat. He roams around in the steppe. He doesn't know about the city, right? He doesn't know how to make proper prayers or knows the rights of the gods, right? He's this brute. He's ignorant. He's dumb, right?" And along with that, this is tied up with this idea of innocence, right? Innocence isn't necessarily a good thing in this context, right? If you take that knowledge and then walk into the Garden of Eden story, as Tristan pointed out, Garden of Eden is polemicizing so much of what's going on in ancient Near Eastern like rhetoric, right? And this is one of the places that it's so clear, and that is that innocence is good. Like, we want ignorance. We want you to stay in this pristine, don't have a lot of knowledge, don't have, access to like common sense sort of things. We don't want that. We want you to be dependent, right? That's what the narrative is saying. And if you think about the way that the narrative functions, and then I'll be quiet, is that the movement throughout is still away from innocence, away from ignorance, away from, this initial state toward the city. It moves toward the city, particularly in Genesis 11. But the difference is it's bad. And that's the key. The movement is exactly the same. It's just bad. And that's what's so clear in the narrative. So I think those are sort of, and that's just one of many, but some of the images, some of the motifs that get pulled from the ancient Near Eastern context, mythological context, and gets reworked in such a way as to make a very strong theological point.
Mm-hmm.
There's
also, it's also this theme of, it's almost like a redemption, people do bad in God and people get kicked out of God, and then again there's a redemption arc that comes in with the story. It's very interesting, and it's so interesting how we as humans, we gravitate towards these stories. It's almost like there's an archetype of this story that's music to our ears. When we hear that kind of a narrative, there's some deep primordial gene that we've inherited from apes that are sitting around the fire talking, that resonates with us on a very, very deep level. I don't know.
I would like to point out briefly, and then Tristan, like maybe you can speak to it as well. But even the use of like the word redemption there, I mean, I think that's culturally motivated and like culturally affected. Like we're using that because even there, unknowingly, we're reading through the lens of the entire canon of the Bible, right? And if you go back to, I think what most scholars would say the flood narrative is doing, it's not so much about redemption, it's about a do-over. Right. And if you think about the Garden of Eden story, like God's not this omnipotent, got everything down. Like it's some trial and error. And you think about what he does there, right? Yeah. He says, all right, creating Adam. All right, now he says it is not good, lo tov, right? Which is to the reader would be a stark contrast to Genesis 1, because at the end of every day, and he saw that it was tov, he saw that it was good, saw that it was good, saw that it was very good. And then Genesis 2, it's not good that man should be alone. Like, well, who did that, buddy boy? You did, right? And, so then what does Yahweh do? Does he create Eve? No, he creates all the animals. And he brings all the animals. And he says, all right, try this one. Try that one, right? And none of them fit. And you can almost, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but you can almost picture, if you're going to paint it, you'd kind of paint.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's...
Tristan, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I just wanted to add and say that it's absolutely, and I can't agree with you more. Dr. Josh, sorry for interjecting. I just couldn't help myself. I found your points so absolutely valid and incredible. And the fact of how you also spoke about innocence earlier, it was a brilliant interpretation, and what I really think is quite fitting to the narrative. And I also should add, I also wanted to add on that earlier note, because I see we're almost done, but I just wanted to note that you also spoke about the cultural exchanges earlier. And the one thing I think is also important to mention in the fact is that Israel, or rather what we understand as Israel in the biblical narrative, was an incredibly important key trade route. And so it had incredible influence, or not connections, but cultural influences from a wide variety of cultures from the ancient Near East. And therefore, even the idea of the Satan archetype in the, the Garden of Eden, and in the Old Testament narrative or motif as a general sense, is the fact of all of these cultural interpretations, because we know that this kind of malevolent entity known as evil, oppressing the sort of narrative of innocence, what Dr. Josh explained earlier, and this evil idea was not just a xenophobic to a certain degree. Well, I also think that it's definitely, it can also be connected to a matter of xenophobia, of all of these cultural foreignness, because of the fact that, Israel, let's be honest, they got absolutely, and I'm not going to use crude language, but they got absolutely obliterated by every single culture they got into contact with. Those poor people did not have an opportunity to just build up, and then they got battered again by the next culture. And so they created this sort of victimism, air about themselves, and assume, and in trying to survive, even with that victimism, they tried to adapt to their vassals. Even you can see that in Deuteronomy as a sort of a vassal treaty that was directly copied from the vassal treaty between Esarhaddon and Israel. But what I wanted to add on that is the syncretism that we can find in the evil, malevolent evil idea that happened after the Second Temple period, in the fact of when Persia and their Zoroastrianism influenced the monotheistic Yahwism. Again came this malevolent evil entity which didn't exist in monotheistic Yahwism before. It was only Yahweh and earlier the Pantheon and the B'nai Elohim. But it wasn't until Zoroastrianism, when all of those polytheistic, I'd say hermeneutic, got thrown out of the basket, and it was just Yahweh versus Satan. And, as Dr. Josh will also note, the word Hebrew for Satan also does not mean a divine entity per se, as the novel New Testament or early church development tradition wants to let you know. It essentially refers to this military and political enmitousness and accusatory thing, also in a polytheistic sense, in the divine realm, or the heavenly court, where the accuser was basically confronting Yaldabaoth because of his claim to divinity. So again, there's this construct of opposing, I'd say, ideals in the ancient Near East that gained several metaphorical and rather allegorical representations in the Old Testament. And I think this is important when we elaborate, or rather incorporate, all of these things. And I think this, the best way to explain it is to use what Dr. Josh said earlier, is this: they wanted to preserve this innocence. They wanted to preserve a matter of obedience to the de facto authorities, enforcing individuals not to listen to what these individuals said, because, oh dear, what if you get a sort of cultural influence from these individuals? It was sort of a segregationist narrative, similar to what happened during apartheid in South Africa. They want to keep the individuals oppressed, because if you keep individuals oppressed, you refrain from them questioning, and you maintain that innocence. And through the Genesis narrative of, to bring it back to the point, the Garden of Eden narrative, I'd say, is incremental to that maintenance of innocence in order to create what one could even describe as an intellectual apartheid.
Interesting. What is wrong with me? Why do I find this so fascinating? I mean, I could listen to this for like days.
Same.
What's wrong with me?
Tristan and I have paid him very well to say those things. Just to let you know.
Very interesting. Well, gentlemen, it's been fascinating. Like I said, I could listen to this for days. I do want to be mindful of both of your time. Any closing, anything in closing to leave our audience with? Dr. Josh?
Yeah, I've got a course that is up on MVP courses over on Myth Vision Podcast, and the title is Borrowed Myths. I think I can't remember what I called the thing, but it is. You can go to MVP courses and find it, but it's basically, I think, 8 45-minute lectures that I give, where I'm just looking at the primeval history of Genesis 1 through 11. The last lecture, we get into some of the Ugaritic parallels, so I kind of leave the primeval history for a minute. But basically, it's talking at length about the stuff that we've sort of been popcorn touching on throughout. So if people are interested in that, again, MVP courses, you can, or I've got a chapter in volume 2, this one, on Did the Old Testament Plagiarize, where I talk about a lot of this stuff as well. So if people are interested in learning more.
Why do you go and write a second volume, Dr. Josh? I bought the first one, and now you.
Sorry.
What gives? What gives?
No, I just want to say I absolutely enjoyed this conversation, Dr. Josh. When I heard that I could have had the privilege to have a conversation with someone of your esteemed qualifications, you know, and also of your convictions in terms of reading your articles and your research, it was absolutely this was tantalizing. It was absolutely phenomenal, and thank you, Dean, for arranging this. This was absolutely phenomenal.
Well, let's make it a first, right? Let's definitely not make this the last. Let's do this some more. No, I really enjoyed it. And you clearly know your stuff very, very well. So no, I really appreciate
I'm happy.
It was great.
Amazing. Gentlemen, again, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Our gratitude, our audience gratitude, and we'll catch you guys again in future for some more of these kind of conversations.
Awesome.
Fantastic.